Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining our symposium. And a big thanks to Brooke, Lucas, Joven, and Kevin for kicking us off. I, Rosemary, will be wrapping up our presentation component with my talk on safe souvenirs, engaging you as tourists to buy safe, sustainable souvenirs while abroad. My pronouns are she, her, they, their. Before I begin, I'd like to make a native land acknowledgement. By recognizing the land of the area upon which I reside here in Cleveland, Ohio, I'd like to express my gratitude to those who lived and worked here before me on this traditional homeland of the Lenape, Shawnee, Wyandotte, Miami, Ottawa, Potawatomi, and other Great Lakes tribes. I'd also like to acknowledge the thousands of Native Americans who now call Northeast Ohio home. To begin, I'd like to introduce you to Safe Souvenirs. Safe Souvenirs is a mobile-ready website on which travelers can learn about illegal or unsafe and legal or safe souvenirs from various countries. It started out as an idea I had for a graduate project, and then quickly turned into a prototype after being accepted as a Zoo Hackathon winner. Now, Safe Souvenirs is a great website for someone like me, but not everyone is like me. Not everyone is out there looking for this tool. In fact, many of you had probably never thought about seeking out such a platform. This is a problem that we as conservationists face all the time. We're so deep in our stuff, we forget to take a step back and think about our audience. So where do we go from here? We have the infrastructure. How do we take this platform and build it into a conservation movement? How do we engage U.S. travelers to use safe souvenirs and shop responsibly while abroad? You all met our moderator, Brooke, earlier. Brooke hosts a course for conservation practitioners trying to take this leap. This presentation covers just some of the primary insights I gathered from this course. Let's start with the problem, or the wicked problem, as we sometimes like to say. The problem we're tackling here is that tourists are purchasing illegal wildlife trade souvenirs while abroad. We don't exactly know how big this market is. Like any illegal activity, it is difficult to measure. But what we do know is that the United States is one of the world's largest consumers of illegal wildlife derivatives, and particular hotspots for wildlife souvenir trade have been identified. For example, in the Caribbean, you have a hotspot for turtle shell souvenir products, like bangles. Research indicates that much of this trade is believed to be carried out by tourists and vacationers who are unknowingly buying souvenirs made from protected and endangered species. Anecdotally, conversations I've had with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service officers about confiscations at ports of entry like airports indicate that this is a problem. In our new, better world, tourists don't buy illegal, non-ethical souvenirs. Instead, they support local communities and conservation efforts by purchasing responsible and sustainable souvenirs. As noted earlier, Safe Souvenirs will provide the infrastructure and tools to help travelers shop for souvenirs abroad. But while I can be a bit of an idealist, I also realize that the existence of Safe Souvenirs as a platform does not necessarily mean that people will use it, and it does not necessarily mean that it will change behavior. Why do I think that? Well, the sustainable travel movement suffers from the value action gap. Studies among tourists show strong positive attitudes towards sustainable travel, but only 1 in 20 tourists act upon them. We have a gap between our environmental attitudes and tourist choices. Safe Souvenirs won't be the first effort to curb demand for illegally traded souvenirs. Groups like WildAid and the U.S. Wildlife Trafficking Alliance are working to raise awareness. You might even be familiar with the U.S. Wildlife Trafficking's Buyer Beware program, which asks travelers to #BuyInformed. While informative tools are indispensable for creating a shift to sustainable tourism behavior, we do need quicker and more radical change. Too Rare to Wear knows this by using a clear, simple, and targeted ask. The goal of the campaign is to end the sale of turtle shell products to travelers in Latin America. And as you can see on the screen, they have simple messaging on their materials, asking their audience to sign their pledge, report turtle shell, and donate to their efforts. We need to close this value action gap. We can do that by really understanding our audience. Full disclosure, Safe Souvenirs has not yet conducted any in-depth user-based research using interviews or focus groups or the such. I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but you'll see in the subsequent slides how we drew upon other methods to understand our audience and how we as Safe Souvenirs can most effectively reach them given our resources and capacity. This involves identifying the key behaviors we need our audience to do, prioritizing the audience through segmentation, and working with motivators to overcome any barriers or challenges our audience might face. And lastly, behavioral segmentation, mapping it all out in a way that fits within the travel framework. So let's begin with our behaviors, and that involves clearly outlined goals. For Safe Souvenirs, our conservation goal is to reduce domestic demand for illegal wildlife souvenirs smuggled into the US. But that is not what we need people to do. What we need people to do in order to meet our conservation goal is to buy sustainable souvenirs while traveling abroad. It's important to remember that our conservation goal is different than our behavioral goal, because our objectives, all those actions that are going to get us there, they need to line up with this behavioral goal. So what are those key objectives? And as we define them, we can simultaneously address the barriers holding our audience back from achieving such objectives. Here in this slide, I'll go over a few examples of objectives and challenges that Safe Souvenirs identified for its audience. We've broken it into 3 stages: before, during, and after travel. In short, this gives us a comprehensive view of the complete travel journey. So for example, before, we'll ask our audience to use the Safe Souvenirs platform. It comes with a few challenges. People don't know about Safe Souvenirs. We have limited resources for advertising and outreach. And the database is lacking a full data set. Usability is still a little limited, so we'll have some back-end challenges to take care of. And people will forget. People will forget to use Safe Souvenirs when they go on their annual trip. While travelers are on their trip, we might ask them to promote and practice conscious consumerism abroad by buying safe souvenirs and asking questions about their origin and sustainability. But some challenges with this might be that the sustainable products are perceived to be more expensive, and it's difficult to distinguish between illegal and legal wildlife items. Not to mention there is a cultural and language barrier, perhaps, and you might be deterred because it feels uncomfortable or confrontational to ask. After your trip, we can ask our audience to raise awareness among friends and family, or write an online review. Challenges? Maybe your family calls you a greenie and a little crazy. Not talking from experience. And there's no platform that specifically caters to sustainable souvenir reviews. So without doing any qualitative in-depth research and interviews with our audience, how did we identify these challenges? Well, first, we made a conscious effort to put ourselves in our users' shoes. We thought about our own travel process, all the barriers that might be faced during it. We talked to family, friends, and people in our networks, and we used existing market research that was already available. Throughout this process, we made sure we didn't disregard anything that we considered might be insignificant, because we were reminded it only takes one barrier or challenge to keep someone from acting in your preferred way. When we're prioritizing our audience, we're really thinking about who needs to do this behavior. Your audience is not everyone, as much as you think it might be. I needed this reminder initially. When I first started out, I was thinking, well, tourists are my audience. But do you know how many global tourists there are? 850 million. That's a really big audience. So I thought smaller. My audience is US tourists, but US international tourists saw a record 93 million trips last year. So to further segment our audience, we've landed on a 2-pronged approach, segmenting by hotspots and touch points. Hotspots are identified wildlife souvenir markets. For example, in Cuba, there are these snails that have very colorful shells, beautiful little snails that are getting harvested and sold to tourists. In the Caribbean is a hotspot for turtle shell projects, like I mentioned earlier, combs or bangles. Now, with touch points, we started to think, where can we meet our audience? Well, all US international travelers have to go through US ports of entry to return back in the country or to exit. This is still a big number, but much smaller than when we started. So now that we have an idea of who we're asking to do the behavior, we want to know as much as we can about them. I've already mentioned that we haven't yet conducted some big official user research, but in the meantime, we've latched onto the already existing market data that we had available to create an idea of who our audience is. Meet Susan. What we've done here is create a persona. The points in the story are based on research data points we've gathered, and we've crafted a narrative around it. For example, the majority of travelers book 1 to 3 months in advance, so Susan here is booking her trip 3 months in advance. Overwhelmingly, polled travelers will book a cruise for their next vacation. So Susan is heading on a cruise with her husband to the Caribbean. And when travelers are polled about what they're looking for in a trip, they want to relax, disconnect. They've earned a trip. They've been so hard at work. So Susan is shutting off her email when she's on her cruise and she is relaxing. Data also shows that those who are 25 years and older most heavily rely on their friends' advice compared to other travel planning tools. So Susan will be checking with her friends for recommendations on things to eat, see, and do in the Caribbean. The majority of younger travelers are known to use social media as an inspiration for their travels. Think Instagram as a platform known for inciting wanderlust. So Susan will make sure she checks Instagram for inspiration before she departs. So what motivates Susan and why do we care? Motivators can overcome those primary barriers. We had a long list of challenges early on. We really needed to identify the primary barriers and choose motivators that we could draw on to overcome such challenges. In the sustainable market research, a few recurring barriers stick out. We've picked some key motivators we think will be most impactful in overcoming those barriers. For example, sustainable travel is difficult, and we understand that shopping for safe souvenirs is difficult. Our audience is likely to face many setbacks and frustrations, leading them to give up. So we need to draw motivators, make sure the ask is fun, makes an impact, and is easy to do. Another example is fear of change. Change is daunting and scary, and when you're in another country, you're dealing with enough change as it is. So to overcome this challenge, we want to show how other people are doing the behavior through norms and influencers. We also want to create a feeling of belonging and responsibility so our audience knows they're part of something bigger, that they're making a difference in their destination community. And we want to remind them that they can make a difference and that it benefits them personally to do so. People need to have the available resources to make this change, so we will need to remind them that this can save them money and time, and possibly legal consequences if they get caught at the airport with an endangered or protected species, for an example. I also just want to mention forgetfulness here as a primary barrier, because I think it's important, especially with safe souvenirs. We're asking people to do a low to medium frequency action. People, or US travelers on average, don't even travel once per year. Most people are only taking a big trip every couple years. So when they're not venturing outside the country, they're going to forget about safe souvenirs and forget about shopping for safe, sustainable souvenirs when they're abroad. So because we're dealing with this forgetfulness, it will be important in our behavioral sequencing and in our messaging to include reminders. Finally, we use behavioral sequencing to bring it all together, drawing on those motivators, those barriers that will help us overcome those motivators. Drawing on motivators to overcome those barriers, such as forgetfulness, and mapping out our actions before, during, and after travel. Here's the Safe Souvenirs behavioral journey all mapped out. You see the blue squares that are objectives, the red circles that are barriers, and the green circles that are motivators. For example, mid-trip, when they're at their departing airport, signage can remind them to use safe souvenirs during travel because they've likely forgot. I talked earlier about a decision to break things up before, during, and after travel. I just want to note here that we actually are drawing on the Tourism Consumption System theory, TCS. It's defined as a set of related travel thoughts, decisions, and behaviors prior to, during, and following a trip. The theory is built on understanding multiple immediate and downstream relationships that happen throughout the travel journey. So in a sense, things that happen earlier on in the trip are going to affect multiple things, both at that moment and later on down the trip. I'll also note that the sequencing plan transfers really well into your strategic plans, and we've actually even incorporated some of these into our grant writing. Throughout this exercise, Safe Souvenirs has realized that a demand reduction campaign relies on understanding our audiences, what challenges they face, what motivates them, and how this all fits into the travel journey before, during, and after the trip. We realized we needed targeted outreach, that we couldn't and shouldn't reach all tourists. Our next steps will be to summarize our findings in a report that will be released to all stakeholders, update the data set with new entries to overcome our data limitations, and seek grant funding so we can talk to our audience and better understand them through some in-depth reuser research, all of which will help us with developing our messaging, as well as market and advertise safe souvenirs to our target audience. Lastly, I want to end on norms, because I do think this is key for our movement. I don't think I have to introduce this young woman. Greta is in part responsible for building norms around sustainable travel. But while the trend is building, we want to make sure that it's developed into an accepted norm, because in the past, sustainable travel behavior has remained largely stagnant. It is my hopes and dreams that we can think diffusion of innovation theory here, that we can convert some early adopters into safe souvenir movements or smaller movements that are then a stepping stone towards more sustainable travel behavior. I'd like to acknowledge Safe Souvenirs partners, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, especially the Office of Law Enforcement out of the Pacific Northwest. Shout out to John Goldman, who's been amazing. The State Department for working with us, getting us funding, and pushing us through the Zoo Hackathon. The Zoo Hackathon gave us a wonderful IT team based out of San Diego. Thank you, Eric, to you and your team. And San Diego Zoo Global, especially Gabe Miller, who has been an indispensable resource for our strategic planning and grant writing efforts. And thank you. Please reach out if you have any questions or if you would like to be part of our sustainable souvenir movement. We are seeking partnership development, especially with U.S. government agencies, conservation nonprofits, U.S. port authorities, especially airports, wildlife trafficking alliances, and groups in the travel and tourism industry. Thank you. And I will just note, I do have this resources slide. These are just some of the resources that really influenced this presentation. Thanks.